Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back. In American literature, I'm going to hope to wind up this story today that we're doing, Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street. This is a story by Herman Melville, the very famous American novelist and short story writer. And just to recap what we have done in the last few lectures, this is a story about a clerk or a scribe who comes to the offices of a lawyer and sort of seems to take over everything. In the sense that in the first few days he does his work industriously. He does everything that he's told to. He's very good in copying. He doesn't seem to take any time off from work. Everyone generally is very pleased with him because he gets no visitors. He doesn't seem to take any lunch or dinner breaks. And so because he's there all the time and because he's working, his employer is very happy with him. But that state lasts only for a little while. And soon the lawyer finds out that although he has a lot of work that needs to be done and the other clerks are doing their bit, Bartleby just sort of refuses to do any work. He gives the reason for not doing as it being very taxing for his eyes. But then he refuses to do any of the other work also that does not involve the use of eyesight in the same way. So because the lawyer, who is also the narrator, has a lot of work that is given to him by the government, and of course he has his private practice also, he starts to get bothered with the idea that here is this person who is being paid so much per week, per month, and yet he refuses to do any work at all. Now the interesting thing is that when he is asked to do something or is instructed to do something, his answer is not rude. It's not insulting. You cannot you cannot contest his use of the language, because he doesn't say, I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that, or I don't want to do it. He says, I'd prefer not to. Now this use of the word prefer is very important as far as this story is concerned. And the use of this phrase has ensured Melville a place in literature, because this phrase became very famous. And this is something that is associated with Bartleby the Scrivener, with his personality as a whole. He is a very quiet gentleman. He is never excited, never nervous or tense, never flustered, never irritated. A very calm and placid personality he has, and a very positive addition to an office where you have Turkey, who flips his lid after 12 o'clock and becomes very irritable and easily excited after 12 o'clock, and Nippers, who is the exact opposite, and then you have Ginger Nut, who is running around the place trying to get people things to eat and otherwise running messages. So in an office like that, Bartleby is a very positive influence because he's calm, he's placid, he does not get upset. But the fact that he refuses to do any work upsets his employer, who tries various ways of getting rid of him, but does not succeed, to the extent that he gives him more money than he has earned as an incentive, and tells him to leave, tells him that if he ever needs his help, he will be there for him, and to leave the office. And yet the next morning when he comes, he finds him there. So it's a very strange situation, because you have a man established in an office where he's not doing any work, where he's not paying any rent, and yet he not only stays there during the daytime, but he also avails of the premises at night time. You know, Bartleby the Scrivener lives in that office. It's not just a figure of speech. This is what he actually does. Because in the very first incident, when the narrator tells him to leave, he comes around and he finds that Bartleby is still there, and he comes early in the morning just to see whether Bartleby has left or not, and he finds that Bartleby is there and he is getting ready for the day. So he's not dressed to receive visitors, as the saying goes. And with the passage of time, he realizes that Bartleby doesn't want to go anywhere, and he reconciles himself to the idea of having Bartleby there and not doing any work. But as long as it pertains to him and his office staff, this is an arrangement that's okay. In time, even Turkey and Nippers and Ginger had come to accept his presence. But what is not acceptable for the narrator is the fact that when people from the outside come in, when his lawyer colleagues come in, Bartleby is there and Bartleby refuses to do any work. If there's nobody in the office and Bartleby is the only one present, and somebody comes in and asks about his employer, Bartleby has no information to give him. He will not even acknowledge the presence of the visitor. And that upsets the lawyer. That is what finally proves to be, let's say, the last straw. And he then tells Bartleby that he will have to go. But I'm skipping ahead. So let us see what we have today, and let's see if we can wind up this short story by Melville today. So when a reference was going on and the room full of lawyers and witnesses and business was driving fast, some deeply occupied legal gentleman, seeing Bartleby wholly unemployed, would request him to run around to that gentleman's office and fetch some papers for him. You know, this was something that was very natural. When there was a reference going on or there was official work being done, the office would be full of all these lawyers and other people who are allied with the legal fraternity. And because there was a lot of work being done, and Bartleby was always there, some gentlemen might ask him to go and fetch something from his office, and Bartleby would not do it. Now that is something that started to rankle his employer, because then people would ask him why he was keeping such a man. He wasn't doing any copying, he wasn't preparing any documents, and he refused to run errands. So why was it that he was there? What was the explanation for his presence? And why was the lawyer tolerating such a person who refused to do what he instructed him to? So this sort of caused the lawyer to sit up and take notice, because people started to raise questions. People started to doubt his authority in his own office, because if he could not control a clerk, how would he go and demand that something be done of other people? So combined with this, his employer started to have other ideas, and one of the ideas was, supposing Bartleby turned out to be a long-lived man and kept occupying my chambers, and denying my authority and perplexing my visitors and scandalizing my professional reputation and casting a general gloom over the premises, keeping soul and body together to the last of his savings, and in the end perhaps outlive the lawyer and claim possession of the office by right of his perpetual occupancy. As all these dark anticipations crowded upon me more and more, and my friends continually intruded their relentless remarks upon the apparition in my room, a great change was wrought in me. I resolved to gather all my faculties together and forever rid me of this intolerable incubus. Okay, so what ultimately proves to be the undoing of this relationship between Bartleby and his employer is the constant goading of his friends, combined with the thoughts that he started to get, and those thoughts concentrated upon Bartleby having a long life, perhaps a longer life than the employer. So he started to think that if such a thing happened and he died before Bartleby, Bartleby might say that, you know, I own this place because I'm here. You know, you hear about Kabza groups. The way that Kabza groups operate is that they go and they take possession of that land or property or whatever. So they'll just go and sit there, they'll put their own things there, and because they are occupying that space, they'll say it belongs to us. So what the lawyer starts to think is that perhaps something like this might happen, and in addition to destroying the professional reputation that he has built up over the years, this would sort of be the last nail in the coffin, that after his death, Bartleby would continue to occupy this office and say that, you know, I occupy this office and therefore it is mine. So combined with the fact that his colleagues were sort of starting to taunt him about this ghost who occupied the office, he decided that he would finally get rid of Bartleby forever and ever, permanently. Ere revolving any complicated project, however, adapted to this end, I first simply suggested to Bartleby the propriety of his permanent departure. So because he doesn't want to sort of do anything that would upset Bartleby, he again asks Bartleby to go. In a calm and serious tone, I commended the idea to his careful and mature consideration. But having taken 3 days to meditate upon it, he apprised me that his original determination remained the same. In short, that he still preferred to abide with me. So very seriously, he asks Bartleby to leave, and Bartleby doesn't say anything. So then he says, okay, you take 3 days to think about it. And at the end of those 3 days, when he asks Bartleby what he has decided, Bartleby says, I would prefer not to. And this puts his employer in a quandary. You know, he gets confused, and he says, you know, what shall I do? What ought I to do? What does conscience say I should do with this man, or rather ghost? Rid myself of him? I must. But how? So he asks these questions of himself because he has started to feel that his professional reputation is being compromised because of Bartleby's presence. So it's like people start taunting him, you know, you don't have any influence in your office, and what is this man doing here, and why are you paying him, why do you tolerate him, etc., etc. So he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to use physical violence. He doesn't want to call in the police. He doesn't know what to do. All that he does know and is convinced of is that Bartleby must go. But how? How is he going to do it? That is that is the paramount question that he has in his mind. He doesn't want to use violence. He tries coaxing, but Bartleby will not go. He tries to bribe him, and those bribes are returned. So no money, no coercion, or no persuasion seems to work. And then he says, so then he decides that something severe must be done, something unusual. But what? What can possibly be the way or the means by which Bartleby would be gone? He can't call the police and put him in jail because he's not done anything wrong. You put people in jail when they have, let's say, run away from something. Bartleby is not running away. In fact, he is the exact opposite. He is staying where he is not wanted. So you can't call him a vagrant. You can't say that he has escaped or he's run away with money or with documents. Bartleby is the most honest of persons. He will return pennies and shillings that the lawyer has dropped, and that other people might just sort of pick up and walk off with. So he's honest. He does not practice any form of dishonesty. He will not accept any money from his employer. So he is totally confused, and he doesn't know what to do. And then he thinks, since Bartleby will not quit him, I must quit him. I will change my offices, I'll move elsewhere and give him fair notice that if I find him on my new premises, I will then proceed against him as a common trespasser. See, the problem is that he called Bartleby into this office. He employed Bartleby. But if he moves to a new place, Bartleby ceases to be in his employment. And so if then he comes there, he can have him prosecuted. He's a lawyer. He knows people. So then he can, bring a case against him of trespassing. But as long as he stays in the present premises, he cannot do that. He employed Bartleby, and therefore he cannot now claim that Bartleby is a trespasser. So the next day he told Bartleby that he was going to move because his chambers or his offices were far from City Hall, and City Hall being the seat of justice, that is where he needed to be. So he had to come up with an excuse, and he comes up with this excuse, and it seems good to him, and he says that, I'm going, and this furniture is going to be moved because the furniture belongs to the lawyer. It doesn't come with the office. So he says that I'm telling you this so that you can look for another place, because I have just 1 week in which I'll be moving to my new office. But of course Bartleby doesn't say anything. So when the week passes, the lawyer brings carts and men, and they proceed to take the furniture out. And because there wasn't much furniture, office furnishings are very basic, so it didn't take long. The last thing to be moved is the screen which separated Bartleby's area from that of his employer. And when that screen was moved, Bartleby was still standing as the sole occupant of a naked room, because the room is stripped of all furnishings. And when that screen is also taken away, the lawyer enters, and he's very nervous, he's tense, and he's upset because he doesn't like doing this to Bartleby. To him, Bartleby has done no harm, and therefore he feels very guilty about moving away from this place because of Bartleby. So he re-enters, and he says, "Goodbye, Bartleby, I'm going. Goodbye, and God some way bless you." And then he tries to give him some money, and he says, "Take that." But Bartleby does not hold out his hand, and the money drops on the floor. The narrator leaves the office, but it's like he has to tear himself away from Bartleby, in spite of the fact that he had so longed to go away from Bartleby. So he goes out of the office, but he feels very guilty, and he feels very nervous and tense. And even when he's established in his new quarters or new offices, for the first few days he's very tense, he is very nervous because he expects Bartleby to turn up. So he keeps his door locked, and he starts up at the smallest sound, because he thinks that that's Bartleby coming in and occupying this office also. And so the early days pass on, and he continues to be tense and nervous. And when he's coming into his office in the morning, he would sort of listen at the keyhole just to confirm that Bartleby was not there. He had this sort of paranoia that Bartleby would come into this office also and take possession. So the first few days passed, and just when he was starting to feel that he was rid of Bartleby forever, he is visited by a strange man, or by a stranger, who asks him if he was the occupant of such and such an office on Wall Street. And the lawyer says yes. He's afraid, but he doesn't know what is coming. So this is a fact. He has been there. He has had offices. And so he says, "Yes, I did have my offices there." So then, "Sir," said the stranger, who was also a lawyer, "you are responsible for the man you left there." So Bartleby is still there. Bartleby has not gone. He refuses to do any copying. So the lawyer has asked him to do work. He refuses to do anything. He says he prefers not to, and he refuses to quit the premises. So the lawyer who occupies the office after the narrator also cannot get Bartleby to do anything, and he can also not get Bartleby to quit the premises. But the narrator says, "I'm very sorry, he is not related to me. I employed him, but he has not worked for me for a long time, and therefore I'm not responsible for him." So then the other lawyer asks him, who exactly is Bartleby? And the narrator says, I don't know. I employed him as a clerk. He came to me. He was good in his work, but he's not been doing anything for me, so I can't tell you anything. So when the other lawyer gets this response from the narrator, he says, "Okay, no problem, I'll settle him." And he takes his leave. Several days passed, and I heard nothing more. And though I often felt a charitable prompting to call at the place and see poor Bartleby, yet a certain squeamishness of I know not what withheld me. So some days passed after this, and although he wanted to go and see what had happened to Bartleby, he was kind of afraid. It was he felt a coward, but he didn't have the courage to go and ask what had happened to Bartleby. And what he does think is all is over with him by this time. And another week passes by, and there is no news of Bartleby. So he thinks, you know, all is over and everything is settled. I don't need to worry about anything. And then one day he comes to his office and he finds people waiting there. And those people are, you know, very tense and very excited. And one man says, "That's the man," when the narrator comes in. And he turns out to be the lawyer who had visited the narrator previously. So the landlord is there, and the landlord says that I want to talk with him because the man that you left there will not go, and you are the only person we know of who has had any contact with him, so you have to take him away. Now, the fact of the matter is that the narrator says that he has nothing to do with him, but the landlord says that, you know, this is very bad for my business. I let out offices to people, and I cannot have people being scared off the premises. And since you were the last person to employ him, you are responsible for Bartleby. And then when the narrator questions the landlord, he finds out that when Bartleby was physically thrown out of the office, he decided to sit on the banister. And the banister of a staircase is a very uncomfortable place. And for those of you who don't know what a banister is, you know, the staircase has sort of what we call railing. Bartleby would sit on the railing at the foot of the staircase, and at night he would sleep in the entrance because he doesn't have that office anymore. So the landlord says that you know, you have to take him away. He will not listen to anyone, and people are getting very upset. People do not want to rent the offices in that building anymore because there's this man sitting on the banister, and that looks very strange. He's there during the daytime. He's there early morning when they come. He sleeps in the entry and he sits on the banister the whole day. So you have to do something about it. And the narrator is, you know, totally confused, and he doesn't know what to do. So he, in spite of the fact that he says, you know, I have nothing to do with him, and he's not done any work for me, the landlord persists and says, you know, you have to do something about it. And those people who are standing there, one of them says, you know, we're going to go to the newspapers and we're going to publish your name there. And that scares the narrator, and he says, all right, I'll talk to him if you give me a private place in which I can communicate with him. So he goes to the same building where he had his office before, and he sees Bartleby sitting on the banister there, and he says, what are you doing here? And he says, sitting upon the banister. Now there's nothing rude about it. He doesn't insult anyone, but he will not move from there. So then he says, okay, come with me to the lawyer's office, and he tries to talk some sense into him. He says, you know, you do realize that you are causing a lot of problems here, and you should not be doing this. Bartleby doesn't say anything. And when the narrator says that one of two things must take place, either you have to do something, or that is earn your living here, or work at something else. So what kind of work do you want to do? would you like to start copying for somebody? And he says, no, I would not prefer to make any change. So he doesn't want to do any copy work. He doesn't want to work as a clerk. So he says, would you like to work in a dry goods store, not in a lawyer's office, maybe a different place? And the response that he gets to that is a very strange one, because Bartleby says there's too much confinement in that, and I would not like a clerkship, but I'm not particular. So he says, a dry goods place is one where nothing happens, and I don't want to work there. But I am not too particular. So the narrator says, maybe you can work as a bartender. There's no eyesight involved there. And Bartleby says, no, I wouldn't like that. And I would prefer not to work as a bartender. So then he says, okay, would you like to travel and collect bills or collect checks? If you go to the countryside, you will be getting a lot of fresh air, and that would improve your health. And he says, no, I would prefer to be doing something else. So then he says, okay, would you like to go as a companion to Europe to entertain some young gentlemen with your conversation? And Bartleby says, no, it doesn't strike me that there is anything definite about that. It's something that is very fluid, and there's no, there is no guarantee that this will happen. So when he says this, it sort of upsets the lawyer, and he says, okay, forget about everything. I am done arguing with you. So when he says, I'm done arguing with you, he is really, at the end of his patience, and he says, if you do not go away from these premises before night, I shall feel bound to quit the premises myself. Again, he comes up with the same thing. Although he's not really living there, he's not occupying those premises. He says, if you don't go, I'll go. And then he gets very, very upset, and he just doesn't know what to do. And then, he sort of does a complete U-turn, and he says, Bartleby, will you go home with me now? And this is like a brilliant idea that comes to the narrator, and he wonders why he had not thought of it before. And he says, will you go home with me and stay there until we can work something out? And Bartleby says, no, I would prefer not to. So the narrator, just sort of loses control. He just loses it totally, and he rushes out of the office and jumps onto a bus, on a train, and he travels around the city, and he is totally confused because Bartleby refuses to listen to any kind of sense. He's upset also. He doesn't want anyone to use physical force, and yet Bartleby is not willing to make any concessions for anyone. So it upsets the narrator so much that he cannot concentrate on his work, and he decides to take a break from work. So he hands over the office to Nippers, and he just takes a tour, and he lives in his vehicle, but he will not live in any place because he's sort of terrified of all confining spaces. The idea of Bartleby haunts him, but he cannot see how he can work his way around that. so for a few days he just disappears from the scene. And when after taking this break, he enters his office, he finds a note from the landlord, that previous landlord, and this note informs him that the landlord had Bartleby removed to the prison, or as Melville calls it, the tombs, and that since he was only aware of the narrator as a person who knew him, he thought that he should communicate this to him. Now this further adds to the confusion in the mind of the narrator. And he's angry, he's upset, but ultimately he thinks that perhaps this is the best solution to the problem of Bartleby. And he thinks that, maybe they could not have come up with anything better than that. It seemed to be the only plan. As I afterwards learned, the poor Scrivener, when told that he must be conducted to the tombs, offered not the slightest obstacle. So Bartleby had gone very quietly. He had not objected. He had just been informed that he was being taken to the prison, and he was taken to the prison. Some people sort of joined in the group, and one of the constables of the police took him by the arm, and very silently they conveyed him to prison, and that's where Bartleby was. Now the same day that the narrator receives the note from the landlord, he goes to the prison to see if he can still talk with Bartleby and see if they can come to some sort of compromise. So he goes to the tombs or the prison. He finds the right officer and tells him why he has called. Because Bartleby had not been conveyed to prison because of a crime that he had committed, he was given license. And further, the lawyer talks to the officer in the prison, and he says, be very gentle with him because he's not committed any crime, and he is harmless. He's not the kind of person who would either hurt someone in physical violence or otherwise try to cheat or lie. So the officer also agrees, because all that he has been told is that this man is illegally occupying space in a building and there seems to be no other place to take him, so please keep him here. And then, he says, I would like to have an interview with him. So he was given permission, and he was taken to the place where Bartleby was standing alone in the quietest of the yards. His face, as in the office, was towards a high wall, while all around, from the narrow slits of the jail windows, I thought I saw peering out upon him the eyes of murderers and thieves. Now remember, this is a prison. Bartleby might be in the prison not because of any crime that he has committed, but there are other people who are in the prison because of crime. So when the narrator sees him in this yard, he senses the eyes of murderers and thieves because he's so guilty. He thinks that he has driven Bartleby to this place. And he's upset because Bartleby has not committed any crime at all. He's the most honest of people, and yet this is where he is because he refuses to do any work, because he refuses to carry out any instructions that are given to him. So when he goes and he finds him in this enclosed yard, he is standing with his face towards a dead wall. And when the narrator calls out to Bartleby, without turning around, Bartleby says, "I know you and I want nothing to say to you." Now this is something that hurts the narrator because he's not done it willingly. He is not responsible for putting Bartleby in that prison, and yet Bartleby holds him responsible. He says, "I have nothing to say to you." And especially when the narrator says that to you this place should not be so vile, because this is like the place that you left. You were alone there and you are alone here, and here at least someone will be taking care of your needs, and there is no stigma that is attached to you because you've not committed a crime. And Bartleby's only response is, "I know where I am." So the fact that he is in a prison is enough to break him down. The office was not a prison for Bartleby because he was there of his own free will. He was there because he chose to be there. But he does not choose to be here. He doesn't prefer to be here. And since for Bartleby everything is a matter of preference, he does not like being in the prison. So the lawyer leaves, and when he's leaving, he is stopped by a man who asks him if he's a friend of the man. And the strange thing is that the lawyer says yes, because he realizes that Bartleby doesn't have any other friends. So he says, "Yes, I am a friend." And then this man who introduces himself as the grub man or the food man says, "Does your friend want to starve to death? Because the food in the prison is terrible and there's very little of it." So he says that all the people here, and here Melville gives the reader a sort of insight into the prison system. When he says that there's this man who's supposed to provide food to those who can afford it. So he says that I am the food man, but this man does not want to have any food other than that which he is provided in the prison itself. So when the narrator realizes this, he says, "I'll give you money and you make sure that Bartleby has enough to eat." So then this grub man says, "Okay, you introduce me to your friend so that he knows who is going to be bringing him food." Yes, when he takes him to Bartleby is really not willing to acknowledge his presence. So the grub man introduces himself to Bartleby and he says that my name is Mr. Cutlets, and just think of the names that Melville gives to his characters. You already have Nippers and Turkey and Ginger Nut, and now you have Mr. Cutlets as the food man. And because this food man makes his money out of providing food to prisoners, he is very ingratiating. He wants to be friends with Bartleby. So he says, Mrs. Cutlets and I would like to have you as guest at our dinner table today. And Bartleby says, "I prefer not to dine today." And when the grub man or the food man says that, we would be very happy if you would join us for dinner, he says, dinner disagrees with me because I'm not used to it. My system, my body is not used to having any dinner. And he just moves aside and faces another dead-looking wall. So the food man is very upset and he says, he's a strange man. And the narrator says, I think he's a little deranged. So when the foodman hears deranged, he is sort of slightly upset, because that means he's mad. And he says, deranged? Deranged? I thought he was a gentleman forger, because the way he dresses, his appearance does not look like that of an ordinary criminal. It doesn't look like that of a madman. And because the foodman is used to the different categories of prisoners here, he thinks that he is a forger, one who makes his living through forging documents and things like checks, for example. And so then he tries to engage the narrator in a conversation about this very notorious forger, Monroe Edwards, and thinking that because he is friends with a prisoner, therefore he must be friends with other criminals and other prisoners. But the narrator says that no, I was never socially acquainted with any forger or with any criminal. I am a lawyer, but I am on the other side of the law. And saying this, he leaves the prison. But that's not the end of the story, because a few days after this, he goes again to see Bartleby, and he is told by one of the turnkeys or one of the jailers that Bartleby has been seen, and he points him in the direction in which he has gone, because everybody knows by that time that Bartleby is totally harmless, so he's allowed to wander around. And when the narrator goes in the direction that he has been pointed to, another jailer or another turnkey addresses him and says, "Are you looking for the silent man?" Because Bartleby does not communicate with anyone. He says, "Yes." So this turnkey says, he's lying there. About 20 minutes ago, he just lay down, and he has not gotten up since then. Now the yard was totally quiet, because this is a place where people or prisoners were not allowed to go on their own. Bartleby is the only one who is allowed to go wherever he wants to, because everyone knows that he's not in for a crime. In the morning, his cell door is unlocked, and he comes out. In the evening, he is escorted back into his cell, because that is prison law, prison rules and regulations. And that's it. Nobody stops him, nobody talks to him, because he doesn't talk to anyone, he doesn't answer anyone. So when this jailer says that I saw him lying down, the narrator goes to where he can see Bartleby curled up in a fetal position, with his knees drawn up and lying on his side, his head touching the cold stones, and he's facing a wall, and his body is totally wasted, because he's not been eating anything at all. Nothing stirred. I paused, then went close up to him, stooped over, and saw that his dim eyes were open. Otherwise, he seemed profoundly sleeping. Something prompted me to touch him. I felt his hand when a tingling shiver ran up my arm and down my spine to my feet. So when he touches him, his body is cold. And that shiver that travels through his arm and runs up his spine and down to his feet is the shiver of touching a dead man. Now, when the narrator is going towards the yard, he's accompanied by the grub man or the food man, who asks a question, and this is perhaps one of the most powerful questions in the story. When the food man says, "Won't he dine today either? His dinner is ready. Or does he live without dining?" Now the food man, because he had been given money by the narrator, had every day prepared his dinner and come to Bartleby to invite him to dinner, to inform him that his dinner was ready. And Bartleby would say, I prefer not to dine. So this use of prefer is something that is like a thread running through this entire story. And when the narrator sees Bartleby dead, he realizes that Bartleby had lived a life in which he had not harmed anyone. He had not done injury to any person, and yet there was no explanation, or there appeared to be no explanation to why he was what he was. And so when the food man says, "He's asleep, isn't he?" The response that the lawyer gives is, "With kings and counselors." It's not an ordinary sleep that Bartleby is sleeping, but it's the sleep that is eternal. It's the sleep that is forever, and for which there is no explanation, beyond which there is nothing, there is no life. This is where this section of the story ends, and this is followed by a sort of explanatory note by Melville, in which he says there would seem little need for proceeding further in this history, because this is the story of Bartleby the Scrivener. But ere parting with the reader, let me say that if this little narrative has sufficiently interested him to awaken curiosity as to who Bartleby was, because readers throughout have raised this question: who was Bartleby? Why was he as he was? What is the explanation? Where did he come from? Why did he not take any food? Why did no one come to him? Why did he not go out to visit anyone? Why did he not have relatives? These are all the questions that have been raised not only by the lawyer or the narrator, but also by the readers who throughout the centuries have read this text. So Melville says, "I do not have any explanation, but what I can share is a rumor that was floating sometime after Bartleby's death, and this rumor stated that Bartleby had worked for a very long time as a subordinate clerk in the dead letter office in Washington. Now, the dead letter office in Washington, according to Herman Melville, is a place where letters that are returned go to, letters for which there is no claimant. And in the majority of cases, these are letters which reach their destination when the addressee has died. And so they are returned to the post office, from where they are sent to the dead letter office to be sorted out and to be burned. So Bartleby, rumor had it that Bartleby had worked as a subordinate clerk in a dead letter office until there was a change in the administration, and the new administration wanted to bring someone else in place of Bartleby, and so Bartleby's job had been terminated. That was when he had come to the narrator, seeking for a place. And since the day that the narrator found him on the threshold of his office, he had stayed with the narrator. So the rumor that stated that Bartleby had worked in a dead letter office, that sort of brought a whole lot of answers, a whole lot of explanations to the mind of the narrator, because according to him, nothing can be worse than handling letters which have reached too late for the addressee to benefit from whatever news or whatever object is being carried in that letter. And the narrator sort of visualizes the entire situation by saying that these letters are transferred from the general post office to the dead letter office by the cartloads. You know, there are so many letters that reach too late for the addressee to read them, and so unopened they are returned, and they end up in this dead letter office where the clerk's job is to open these letters to see if there is any object therein, and to make piles of these objects and throw these letters into the furnace where they are burnt. Now, the imagination of the narrator runs wild when he thinks of the person sorting out these letters, and what he must be feeling when he is continually confining these letters to the furnace. And every now and then, perhaps he comes upon some item like a ring that is being returned, or perhaps a note, perhaps money that is being sent to a person who is in need of it, but by the time it gets there, the person for whom it is intended is no more. And since the law dictates that if the addressee is not present, the letter be returned to the post office, people would not read that letter, would not open the letter, and would just return it as it is. So these letters that come to the dead letter office have hopes that are expressed in the letter, hopes of better times, perhaps good news, but the good news reaching the addressee too late, reaching the addressee at a time when that individual is dead and gone. So according to Melville, there can be nothing worse than having a job when you are sorting out letters that were meant for people who are no more in this world. And according to him, that sort of explains why Bartleby was the way he was, why he didn't want to communicate with anyone, why he had no friends, no relatives, why there was no desire in him to eat or drink, why there was no desire in him to communicate anything. And when his eyesight fails and he loses the desire or the inclination to work, all that he can do is stand looking at a dead wall and thinking of all those people whose letters he has sorted out and who are no more. And for the narrator, for Bartleby to die friendless and to die without anyone being present at his death is perhaps the most tragic thing that could have happened. But it is something that provides a fitting end to this story of a clerk who spends a life in which no individual, no human being has any importance, and in time even papers and documents cease to have any importance for him. And the last few words, the words with which Melville winds up the story, sort of sum up the story when he says, "Our Bartleby, our humanity." Humanity does not realize what it entails when an individual is confined to a place where he has no communication with any other human being. So to sum up this entire story, and to sum up particularly the lecture that we have done today, and which winds up this really rather tragic story of a clerk who lives friendless and who dies friendless, Melville uses these words, "Our Bartleby, our humanity." So this is like an epitaph for a clerk who lives in a very small confined place, and when he is forcefully evicted from that place, he still chooses to have no communication with anyone, and all that he can do is stand looking at a dead wall, a wall that has nothing to relieve its monotony. His life is monotonous. His life is unchanging. He lives without any friends, without any acquaintances or relatives, and he dies without any relatives or friends around him. When he is living, he has no desire to eat or drink. He has no desire for companionship, because he is a solitary man. He is a man who does not have any ambition, who doesn't seem to have any desires, for whom worldly comforts have no significance. And when he is evicted from the office space that he had occupied during his time with the narrator, he still sits on the banister of the staircase, because that is the only place where he will not be a hindrance to any person coming or going, from where no one can remove him. And yet there comes the day when he is not even allowed to sit there. So what Melville is trying to say is that Bartleby was a totally harmless man. Remember, the narrator had emphasized the fact that he was a very honest man, and that if there were any pennies or shillings that had dropped out of his pockets, Bartleby would collect them all and restore them to the rightful owner. He wouldn't take a single penny. When the narrator tries to give him some money so that he can find accommodation elsewhere, he's not willing to take it. So he doesn't want money. He doesn't like food. He doesn't take any food. He doesn't want any favors from anyone. All that he wants is to be left to himself. All that he wants is to occupy that little space on the banister and that little space in the entry where he sleeps at night. And yet, even that is denied to him. Even that is considered to be an infringement of the legal fraternity's rights. And so he is sent to the prison, although he has not committed any crime at all. Yet there doesn't seem to be any other place for him. The next thing that would have come would have been the almshouse or the poor house, where people go because they have no place to live, and where you are fed on charity. So according to the narrator, perhaps the prison was a better place, because that was a place where he was allowed to wander, where he was allowed to move about, and nobody stopped him, nobody was bothered by him. But what a life to live, and what a way to die. Thank you for your patience. That's all for today. We'll be doing something new in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.